Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. Delighted to have back Mike Zamore, who is the political director of the ACLU. And what a time for the ACLU, what a time for our Constitution. Mike, if you recall back, and I'm sure you do, maybe our audience may be a little fuzzy on the details at this point, but April 7th, the Supreme Court issued a per curiam opinion. That's just a signed, usually short opinion, saying, we're kind of divided on exactly how you're going to pursue cases against the government for the deportation of people who were illegally here. But the one thing we can all agree on, said the per curiam opinion, is everybody gets due process. Fine. The dissent was very upset. They said, I think you should trust these people. And if they do, they will be violating the order of this court. Take us forward now to last Friday or Thursday and tell us what you learned that caused you to believe, in fact, the government wasn't necessarily going to follow that guideline.
Sure. Thanks, Jen. Appreciate you having us and appreciate all of your good work to help explain what's happening in this wild world to your listeners and viewers. So the case at the Supreme Court that you referenced basically said the case that the ACLU had brought in DC was not the right place to hear that question, and that the challenges on behalf of these Venezuelan men who are being summarily disappeared into this gulag in El Salvador had to be heard in the judicial districts where they were at the time by a judicial process called habeas corpus motion. So our lawyers immediately started filing habeas petitions in lots of different places. So they did it immediately in New York, in South Texas, Colorado, Pennsylvania, North Texas, all these places. And every court that was hearing it was immediately issuing the same kind of temporary restraining order that Judge Boasberg did in Washington, D.C., that the government objected to. Because as the Supreme Court noted, it is incumbent on the government to give these people a chance to challenge their deportations under this policy, this Alien Enemies Act, which is, this wartime authority written into statute in the 1700s, and very, very rarely used, and certainly never used in this way. So we were challenging these cases, and in the Northern District of Texas on Thursday, the judge that we were in front of ruled that a temporary restraining order was not necessary because the named plaintiffs that we were representing, so we had a couple of plaintiffs who were specific people, and then we were trying to bring a case on behalf of everybody else who's similarly situated, so all the other Venezuelans at risk of being sent to El Salvador. And he said, look, the government's promised not to deport your particular clients, so I'm not going to issue a temporary restraining order. Almost immediately, it seems, the government then started giving notice, this one-page notice to Venezuelans in a facility in that district in Texas, saying, you're a part of Tren de Aragua. We are going to send you out of the country under this authority of the Alien Enemies Act. If you want to make a phone call, you can make a phone call. So this is a far cry from what the Supreme Court said is necessary. The Supreme Court said, DC is not the right place. You got to bring these habeas cases. And it is imperative that the government give these Venezuelans a chance, a meaningful chance, to challenge their deportation under this authority, meaning time and notice and an explanation. The piece of paper that they received was only in English and explained none of those things. And they were being allegedly put onto buses within 12 hours of receiving that paper. So no real.
Did you find that out? Did the government fess up during the court hearing that this is being done for other people, not your named plaintiffs, or
we raced back to court. Our lawyers raced back to court because we heard from clients that these papers are being distributed and they were being told they were going to be sent to El Salvador. So so it was we simultaneously, our legal team, immediately went to the Fifth Circuit, to Judge Boasberg back in DC, who still has jurisdiction over some piece of this case, and to the Supreme Court for emergency relief, because buses were
Let me
rolling.
just
Yeah.
let me just stop right there. You went to the Fifth Circuit. Did you get any indication from the Fifth Circuit when they were going to rule, or there was just radio silence at that point?
No, I mean, my understanding from our team is that we actually went to the Fifth Circuit and the Supreme Court simultaneously. And so then the Fifth Circuit basically said Supreme Court's taking care of this. So, you know,
And you did that precisely because you were concerned that while this was going on, they would still send people out, just as they did in front of Judge Boasberg, who actually had told them to turn the planes around. And now there's a dispute as to whether they directly and in contempt of court violated that directive. So this was a case of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, that you kind of suspected what they were up to. Let me ask you a more granular question, because I'm very concerned with the way the lawyers representing the Justice Department are conducting themselves in court. When that lawyer made a representation, we are not going to be deporting any of the named plaintiffs. Was he just hiding the ball from you in the court at that point? Was he playing word games, or did he not know about this? What's going on between the lawyers and the people who are running these deportations?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that the courts are getting also very frustrated with lawyers, so you're not alone in this. The same night that we went to the Supreme Court, we also went back to Judge Boasberg, and he heard it earlier in the evening. And basically his take was, obviously, this is not comporting with the Supreme Court's order. And the fact that the lawyer in that case said, we're not going to be sending any planes on Friday or Saturday, except in and then it was like with a parentheses, except, you know, unless it's in compliance with the court. So the like headline of that message was, we're not going to be sending any planes. But then it was like this big asterisk. And I think Boasberg's take on that was like, that is not a, you know, I just can't trust that representation at this point based on everything that's come before. However, he also concluded the Supreme Court has tied my hands. They very clearly said this is not a case that I should be ruling on. I've got to defer to them. So, but
they were putting them on buses, not on planes. Is that what they were saying? I mean,
I don't know. Like, I think is clear from everything that we have seen on these cases, on the Abrego Garcia and others, is that they are systematically stonewalling and trying hard not to comply with the court. And you know, whether it's like weasel words to try to like say sort of we're yes kind of in compliance, or whether the lawyers aren't fully informed, or whether they are flat out, you know, misconstruing the facts. Like, I don't have answers to that, but I think what is clear is this administration is really trying hard not to follow the court orders.
Are you confident, as you can be, that after the 1 a.m. Order from the court, and I must say, I do not remember a single order at that hour of the morning or night, with the exception of death penalty cases. Have you ever seen anything like this?
I mean, I'm not the one to ask, but no, it does seem exceptional, and I think it does speak to to the court, the justice's concern, I think.
Are you reasonably concerned that, or reasonably certain rather, that the per curiam opinion closes whatever loopholes the government thought it was doing for now for going forward in terms of future deportations?
Under the Alien Enemies Act. So this doesn't stop them from using other authorities to send people to El Salvador. But under the Alien Enemies Act, the Supreme Court left no wiggle room, right? They said, you may not use this authority until you hear back from us. So, you know, assuming that the administration is still pretending to be on the side of the rule of law, we should be all right.
And are they using the Alien Enemies Act precisely because they don't want to have an individualized hearing and due process for each and every one, that kind of slows down their mass, transit of large groups of people out of the country? Is that why they are invoking that? Or is there some other rationale that you could think of that would resort to this 18th century law that really is reserved for wartime and for a foreign nation that has either invaded or has engaged in warfare with the United States?
Yeah, I think that is certainly the primary driver, is that this is just like a very broad authority to essentially scoop people up and send them out of the country. I do think there's a secondary piece of this, which is the Trump administration systematically trying to stretch their powers. And it's the emergencyification of governance, and saying, oh, this is an emergency, so the normal rules can't apply. And I think that for them, it has the specific benefits of being able to deport people quickly, but also the secondary benefit of, again, like normalizing and stretching the bounds of their power, and tearing down separations of power and limits on what they can do.
Now, rather than explain why due process doesn't apply or go to the merits of any of these cases, the administration, its spokesman, simply repeats without producing any evidence, these are bad people, these are terrorists, these are gang members. Correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a while since I was in law school, but due process applies to everyone, including people who are accused of crimes. And that's not an answer, that's an appropriate answer for the president or the Justice Department or anyone else to give. So why are they doing that?
The whole point of due process, as you say, Jen, is to ensure that the person that is in custody is like legitimately in custody, and even that they're the person that you allege them to be. So they might have a different Jen Rubin. I'm sure you're not the only one out there, right? So this is the whole notion of due process: is you have a chance to challenge the accusations against you and make them prove something. And if the government is allowed to just lock people up or send them into a foreign gulag on their own say so with no proof, who is safe? Nobody is safe. So this is the whole idea of due process. It's why it applies to everybody. It's why this idea of habeas corpus exists, where like if somebody's wrongfully detained, there is a legal mechanism to make them produce that person and come to court and justify the detention. And I think that the why question that you're asking, I think, goes to the heart of what this administration is about. And I think we all have our theories of why they want unbridled power and why they want the Constitution's rights and freedoms not to apply equally to everybody. Why they're trying to assert the ability to pull the levers of government to reward their friends and punish their enemies. I think there's a lot of patterns that this fits into.
So giving people a piece of paper that says we're putting you on a bus in an hour is not due process. Do you have any understanding of what due process now the government is prepared to afford? Or are they dropping this entirely because they don't want to have hearings, individual hearings on these people? In other words, should we expect 200 hearings of some type or another over the next few months? Or should we expect nothing and this whole thing kind of sputters out because they don't have individualized proof?
Well, let first of all, we should be clear that the Supreme Court has not issued the final word on this case.
Yeah.
And behind all of these questions of due process is a more fundamental question, which is, can the administration invoke the law under these circumstances when we clearly are not being invaded by a foreign power, right? Like that is not what is happening. And so that question on the merits of the law being used in this way is still yet to be litigated. Whether the administration is going to provide the due process that's required. Remember, like this it isn't optional for them. So whether they're going to actually create a mechanism for hearings to happen for all of the Venezuelan men they want to send to El Salvador or not remains to be seen. But we would argue that none of these men should be in custody under this authority right now because the authority is being misused.
Now, which comes first? Are people have an opportunity going to say, hey, I'm not one of these members, whatever you're claiming authority you might have, or does the issue of whether the Alien Enemies Act get litigated first, and that may wipe out a whole class of individuals?
Yeah, it depends. The administration is clearly going to fight every step of the way on that question of the merits of the use of the law in this way. It really probably comes down to whether they're determined to try to send people abroad while the merits question gets litigated. If they are, then there's going to have to be some kind of process provided. And we would argue that if they're being detained under that provision, they should still get the due process. Like, this is not, you don't get to just lock somebody up without due process either, right? It's like deprivation of life, liberty, and property. So this is we think that the process should apply in any, regardless of whether they're getting sent to CCOT or whether they're sitting in a detention facility that ICE runs in Texas.
And those people who are in El Salvador, under habeas corpus law, and the Supreme Court repeated this, if you're outside the United States, you get to come to DC in order to have that habeas corpus claim. How does that work? Are they going to have to return those people? Are they going to set up like a little courtroom in an embassy in El Salvador? How are they going to do this?
I don't know what the logistical arrangements would be. I think we may learn more this week, maybe. So as you noted, like, this whole case started with plane loads of people being sent against the orders of Judge Boasberg, who told them to turn those planes around and not let them take off. And so while all of this other things have been playing out, there's also been this question about whether the government was in contempt of court by not turning the planes around and letting other planes take off and send people to El Salvador that very first night. Last week, there was a separate hearing on that question of contempt, and Judge Boasberg found probable cause that the government was in contempt. And he gave them two choices, basically, which is by later this coming week, they have to either purge the contempt, which means like rectify the situation that they created. And he did say, in the context of purging the contempt, you can provide the due process that was not given without bringing those people back to the United States. So he is envisioning some form of process from El Salvador. And again, like, if the government refuses to do even that, then he laid out a series of steps that may follow to try to essentially compel the government to act within the orders of the court.
Now, that decision was temporarily stayed by a panel of the DC Circuit, including two judges, one of whom is continually in the tank for this administration, the other who is sometimes in the tank. My words, not yours. What is that about? And how can that get unstuck? Do you have a more extensive hearing? Do you go en banc? How do you get that revived again?
Yeah, so that was an administrative stay. It was basically buying time for them to actually consider the appeal from the government. So we should learn more, I would think, this week. And when they actually rule on the appeal of Judge Boasberg's order, then we'll have to assess where we are and what the next steps are from there.
Last question for you as we reach the end of our time. There is the separate case that many people are perhaps more familiar with because it's a single individual, and that's Kilmar Abrego Garcia. His case was brought in the Fourth Circuit, Judge Zenas, and her order was to go facilitate his return. It has become apparent that in the eyes of the administration, facilitate means that if this guy escapes from jail, winds up on our border, we'll open the door and let him come back in, but no more. It doesn't,
Well,
maybe even not that.
I mean, last week they said if he comes back, he will be immediately deported again.
Right,
So
exactly.
I feel like
So what, so she said, okay, I smell a rat. I want 2 weeks of discovery, meaning you get to send questions, you get to put people under oath, and I want to find out what you have done. How is that going to work? And what if they start not cooperating with that and start invoking executive privilege and state secrets and all the rest? And you can't even figure out who gave the order and who's doing what.
Yeah, it is. I mean, first of all, can we just say that is a heartbreaking case where a Maryland dad has been, like summarily disappeared,
Whisked off. Yeah.
and it's just, and the character assassination and the gleeful celebrating of his wrongful detention by this administration is absolutely inhumane and disgusting. That case, so just to be clear, the ACLU is not representing him, so that's not our case. But it's in a sort of similar posture at this point to the case involving the Venezuelans who are wrongfully detained in El Salvador at this point. And so Judge Zenas is going to have, I think, a tough challenge here. I mean, like Judge Boasberg ordered, but as you noted, the DC Circuit has stayed. Like, she is basically saying, look, I want to get the facts, and you got to put the people who can provide the real facts, make them available, and let's get to the bottom of this. And when or if they don't comply, she's going to be faced with a similar set of options that Judge Boasberg is trying to implement, including, probable cause of contempt and various things. The end of the line that Judge Boasberg described is like, look, if you're not going to provide the people by, or information by declaration, and you're not going to make people available for depositions and under oath, and you're not going to, sort of tell us what really happened, then, I will have no choice but to refer for criminal contempt prosecution to the Department of Justice. And if the Justice Department doesn't comply, then the next step would be to appoint outside counsel to prosecute that case. So that's like the ladder that he laid out. I imagine that Judge Zenas will be like looking at similar options. We haven't really been in this situation, right, where like the administration on multiple fronts is refusing to do what courts order. And I'll be clear, like they have, they are doing a lot of foot dragging, they're doing a lot of obfuscating, they're doing a lot of stonewalling. They're not in court, they're not declaring like, you're not the boss of us,
Right.
So
they're doing that in the Oval Office. They're doing that on
different story on social media, right?
But they don't have the nerve to do it in court.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just a remarkable turn of events, Mike. And I want people to understand what is at stake here. If they can grab someone without due process, put them on a plane, a boat, a train, whatever, ship them off to a gulag without any individual examination of who they are, what they've done. They can do this to anyone. They can do this to, as Trump says, homegrowns. Those are US citizens he's talking about. He's already identifying people who he thinks have wronged him. So we are talking about the untrammeled power of the President of the United States to summarily grab people off the streets without due process and throw them in a foreign prison and then declare we can't get them back. Now, if that's not the definition of a dictatorship, I don't know what is, Mike. And I think we are very fortunate that we have groups like the ACLU, other groups, other lawyers. But are you optimistic at this point or pessimistic that we're going to get back to some kind of normal legal order in which we're not sending people willy-nilly overseas, and the people who are wrongfully detained will get to come home. Do you think
Yeah.
that's possible in any kind of finite time frame?
I certainly hope so, because I think you lay out the stakes exactly right. And I will note that the excuse for using this Alien Enemies Act to send people to El Salvador is that they are Venezuelan gang members, they allege. And deep dives have been done into these people now who have already been sent, and the vast majority of them have no criminal record in any country. So obviously, the administration can't be trusted with their assertions or allegations about who people are. And so, maybe somebody gets picked up off the street and isn't a Venezuelan, or isn't a gang member, or is a US citizen, or whatever. And again, once they're there, they would say, well, our hands are tied. So, look, I think that we should take some measure of cautious optimism that the Supreme Court initially ruled 9-0 that you got to provide some kind of due process. This latest decision that put the kind of basically pulled up the drawbridge essentially and said you can't keep sending people across that moat into El Salvador, was 7-2. The two you would expect were the dissenters, but I think that all the judges who have heard this stuff have expressed alarm at the way the administration is trying to play this. I think people recognize the stakes. I also think we have to understand that we cannot rely on the courts to save us, and this is going to take an all of society push to ensure that this administration is bound and is subject to the laws and the Constitution, and that we demand, that they honor the rights and freedoms that matter to all of us, regardless of whose rights are on the line at any given moment.
Absolutely. Well, it must warm your heart. It certainly warmed mine to see people shouting at rallies this weekend, due process. I mean, this is a rally that only a lawyer or a former lawyer or someone who appreciates the law could relish. So yes, due process, hash mark. Thanks so much, Mike, for coming and explaining all this. I am sure, unfortunately, we'll have you back to guide us through this period of time, but thank you. And thanks to the ACLU. Our folks out there, you're always asking what you can do to support democracy. Support the ACLU, and that's a good way to start. Thanks so much.
Jen.
See
Good
you
to be
next
with you.
time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.